Jamie Shea is a former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges, and he joins us now. Thanks very much for talking to us today, Jamie. So, NATO has said that it will send forces to where they're needed. What action do you see it taking in the coming hours and days?
Well, I think the key thing for NATO is to prevent the Russian invasion of Ukraine from spilling over onto NATO territory. And that's not unthinkable, because we see now Russian forces in Belarus. We see Russian forces now not just in the east of Ukraine, but also attacking the center of Ukraine. That is going to bring Russia much closer to the vicinity of NATO. And therefore, the warning time for NATO has gone down. And NATO obviously has to make sure that it can at least stop any incursion of Russia onto NATO territory. So I think what we saw from the meeting of NATO ambassadors this morning were decisions to quickly move reinforcement forces east into the Baltic states, into Poland, into the Black Sea region, to put the NATO response force of 40,000 troops on maximum alert so that they can move quickly, to proceed with the decision of NATO defense ministers last week to establish 4 new multinational battalions in the Black Sea region, essentially Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary and Slovakia. And you've seen also many NATO countries like the United States pledge in recent days to send extra forces. So I think today NATO will be asking those countries to make sure those forces get into their forward positions as quickly as possible to deter any Russian adventurism that could try to go beyond Ukraine onto NATO territory itself.
You say this invasion spilling over beyond Ukraine is not unthinkable, but do you think it's likely?
Well, it's very difficult to speculate with somebody like Putin, because a couple of months ago, people were saying that Putin would not invade Ukraine. It was only a sort of gesticulation in order to apply pressure. Then people were saying, well, you know, all he will do will be to basically put Russian forces into the areas where Russian separatists have been occupying territory for 8 years in the Donbass region. And we can take Putin's assurances that these are just military exercises which will be ending very soon. Forces will be going back to bases. All of those hypotheses have been completely discredited by what we see today. So if I were a NATO ambassador or NATO Secretary General, I certainly wouldn't be trusting Putin. I wouldn't be leaving anything to chance. And I'd want to make sure that my defenses were as robust as I can possibly make them over the next 48 hours to 1 week.
Do you think NATO will hold firm over this?
I do. I think it will. What you've seen over the last couple of weeks is lots of allies rallying around the NATO calls. The United States has been increasing significantly the number of aircraft, the number of forces that it has in Europe. Elements of the 82nd US Airborne Division have been deployed in Poland. You've seen the UK, Germany, France, lots of names I could mention, agreeing to deploy additional forces as well. The fact of the matter is that collective defence is NATO's DNA. It's what it was created to do. It's the core mission. It's the one that everybody has been rehearsing in numerous NATO exercises and NATO defence plans since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. So this is not a sort of voluntary type of mission like Afghanistan, where allies may be more or less committed. This is, as I said, core NATO business, where the defence of everybody is tied to the credibility of those NATO guarantees. And therefore, yes, I think NATO will stay the course, just like it stayed the course for 40 years during the Cold War.
And we also had a call from NATO today for Russia to choose diplomacy. But is there really still a diplomatic path out of this?
It doesn't seem highly likely at the moment, it has to be said, because diplomacy has been tried. President Putin has never received so many visits from foreign heads of state, so many telephone calls, so many foreign ministers, all trying the diplomatic path and offering Putin for many weeks what NATO would have considered to be quite reasonable off-ramps for a diplomatic solution. For example, starting arms control talks in Europe, negotiating through the so-called Minsk agreements on the future of the Donbass, the threat of sanctions that Putin could have avoided by not invading Ukraine. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked. So I think at the moment, the scope for diplomacy is small, unless Putin withdraws those forces immediately. But the fact that they've penetrated so deeply into Ukraine today, unfortunately, doesn't suggest that that's about to happen. So I'm afraid it's going to be the containment of Russia by NATO for the time being, secure NATO defences, and diplomacy will no doubt resume at one stage in the future, but in very, very, very different conditions to what we had until Russia started its invasion this morning.
Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General at NATO, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you.